If you want to reduce audit risk, you don't need to rewrite every note you write. That's usually the first mistake people make. They assume audit safety comes from making documentation longer, clearer everywhere, or more detailed overall. In reality, audit exposure comes from a much smaller surface area. It shows up at very specific moments. Moments where a reader needs to understand why something was done, not just what happened. So, in this video, I'm going to walk you through where ambiguity actually creates risk and how to fix it in real documentation without adding explanation, without storytelling, and without increasing how much you write. Before we get into examples, there's one framing rule you need to keep in mind the entire time, and that's this. When documentation is reviewed, the reader is not asking whether you were thoughtful, careful, or well-intentioned. They're asking something much simpler. Was this decision deliberate, or am I being asked to infer intent? Anytime intent has to be inferred, risk increases. That's why clarity does not need to exist everywhere. It needs to exist where choices were made. And there are 3 places where those choices reliably show up. Let's walk through them one by one using real examples. A decision boundary exists anytime more than one reasonable option was available and one was chosen. This is not rare. It happens constantly. Starting something, stopping something, continuing something even though conditions changed. At these moments, the focus is not on whether the decision was correct. What matters is whether the decision is visible. Let me give you a common example. A professional documents, treatment continued as planned. In real time, that feels fine. But under review, this raises an immediate question. Why was it continued? Was improvement expected? Was there uncertainty? Was there risk? Now the reviewer has to interpret. Instead, listen to this. Treatment continued based on stable findings and absence of adverse indicators. Do you notice what changed? There's no explanation, no defense, and no story. But the decision boundary is now clear. A choice was made. It was tied to observable criteria, and the reader does not need to guess. Here's another example. The original note says, medication initiated. Okay, that tells us what happened, but not whether a decision was made. Now, here's a revised version. Medication initiated after documented criteria were met. See that? Again, there's no narrative and there's no justification essay. Just a visible decision boundary. When a reviewer sees this, they don't need to ask whether the action was intentional. That question has already been answered. And once intent is explicit, interpretation drops. Now, once you start seeing decision boundaries, you'll notice that many of them appear not at the start of care, but when something changes. Which brings us to the second place ambiguity creates risk. Deviation is one of the fastest ways to trigger scrutiny. And this is where professionals often get burned without realizing why. A deviation can be small. Something happening earlier than expected, later than expected, less than expected, or not happening at all. In real life, these deviations often feel self-explanatory. Under review, they are not. Here's a very common example. A note says, follow-up deferred. That's it. To the author, the reason is obvious. To a reviewer, this raises immediate flags. Deferred because of what? Capacity? Condition? Risk? Now the reviewer has to infer whether this was intentional or whether something was missed. So, instead, compare it to this. Follow-up deferred due to the current stability and absence of escalation indicators. Notice, nothing dramatic changed. But now, the deviation is labeled as deliberate. The reviewer doesn't need to guess whether this was an omission. Okay, here's another example. The original says, procedure not performed today. That statement alone creates ambiguity. But revised, it says, procedure not performed today due to unchanged findings and no progression. Notice? Again, no explanation, no long story. Just a deviation clearly marked as intentional. This matters because systems and reviewers do not assume good judgment. They look for signals of control. When a deviation is unlabeled, it looks uncontrolled. But when it's named and bounded, it looks deliberate. Now, decision boundaries and deviations are relatively easy to spot once you know to look for them. The third risk point is more subtle and often the most dangerous. Implied justification. It happens when a note assumes the reader will agree with the conclusion without seeing the logic. This usually shows up in certain words. Words like appropriate, stable, improved, per plan. These words feel efficient. They feel professional. But under audit review, they are not protective by themselves. Let me show you what I mean. A note says, care appropriate at this time. Appropriate based on what? The author knows. The reviewer does not. Now, the reviewer must interpret whether appropriate was justified. Instead, consider this version. Care appropriate based on stable indicators and no evidence of deterioration. Notice? Nothing got longer. Nothing got defensive. But the justification is no longer implied. It's closed. Here's another example. The original says, patient stable. That's vague under scrutiny. Revised, it could say, patient stable with no change in documented indicators. See that? Now the word stable is anchored. The action doesn't rely on agreement. It relies on structure. This is what it means to close the loop. You're not persuading the reader. You're completing the logic, so no interpretation is required later. Now, let's pause here because this is where many people go wrong. Once they understand these three areas, they try to apply clarity everywhere. And that is a mistake. More explanation does not equal more safety. In fact, it often increases exposure. Why? because every additional explanation adds surface area for interpretation. What you want instead is precision at the right points, decision boundaries, deviations, and justifications. That's it. Let me show you how this plays out in a more complete realistic scenario. Imagine a reviewer reading multiple notes over time. They're not reading one note in isolation, they're comparing patterns. They see continued as planned, stable, per plan, and appropriate, over and over. None of these are wrong, but none of them are anchored. So the system flags inconsistency. Now, compare that to a record where decisions are labeled, deviations are named, and justifications are closed. Nothing dramatic and nothing excessive, but the notes stand on their own. This is how experienced professionals reduce audit risk without increasing documentation volume. So, let's bring this together. If you're trying to make your notes safer by adding more background, explaining your reasoning, or narrating the situation, you're likely increasing risk. Instead, your goal is much narrower. You make sure that when a choice is made, it's visible. When something deviates, it's intentional. And when a justification is implied, the loop is closed. That's it. If you take one thing from this video, take this. Stop trying to make your documentation clearer overall. Start making decisions, deviations, and justifications unmistakable. That is where ambiguity actually creates exposure, and that is where it can be fixed. In the next video, I'll explain how systems compare notes over time and why consistency matters more than wording.